Hello, I'm Adrian, and today we're taking an in-depth look at Nathan Drake's fighting style in the Uncharted video game series. Nathan Drake made his debut in the Naughty Dog developed, critically acclaimed, PS3 exclusive Uncharted Drake's Fortune back in 2007, and went on to star in highly successful sequels leading up to his seemingly last adventure, Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. If you're a fan of action films and video games, I highly recommend subscribing to my channel and watching my other videos, as I've already analyzed other awesome video game fighters, including Solid Snake and Lara Croft. But today, we will be focusing exclusively on Nathan Drake. The goal of these videos is to figure out just how many fighting styles our combatant is familiar with by analyzing the specific moves featured in their footage and pairing them with the martial art or fighting style which most aptly represents those moves. There's a huge amount of crossover in martial arts techniques, and a technique that is present in one fighting style may also be present in another, such as a roundhouse kick being present in multiple martial arts. But in order to not give combatants multiple fighting styles for the sake of variety, I've instead opted to list the most apt fighting style that best represents that particular character, technique, or set of techniques. Also, there are various degrees of knowing a fighting style, and although one may know elements of something, this doesn't mean I'm saying the fighter I'm talking about is a master in every style I mention. And this especially applies to Nathan Drake, but we will get to that later. I highly recommend playing the Uncharted video game series, as this video will analyze footage from Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and Uncharted 4 A Thief's End. That being said, I will keep plot and story details to a minimum, but do take this as your spoiler warning. Fighting styles that Drake may know in any other form of media, such as in comics or novel form, or other game series, including PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, do not count. Without further ado, let's take a look at how many fighting styles Nathan Drake knows. Nathan Drake is an experienced and knowledgeable treasure hunter with seemingly unending upper body strength, as he is able to shimmy, jump, climb, and hang from any surface known to mankind. Having grown up in a Catholic orphanage, he never underwent any formal training in combat. However, throughout his time as a treasure hunter, he has picked up several skills that have aided him in his adventures, and those are the skills we're going to analyze today. We begin with the first game in the series, Uncharted Drake's Fortune. The developers had a very clear goal in mind, in that they wanted to portray the adventures of a quote-unquote ordinary guy. So this meant that Drake's hand-to-hand skills, while present, were certainly not with a particular martial art in mind. In fact, Sam Thompson, the producer of its sequel, Among Thieves, describes Drake's martial arts abilities as fallible. However, Drake improved considerably in his abilities as further installments were made, which makes sense considering that he gained more and more experience fighting. With that in mind, let's take a look at what fighting without training can potentially look like. Probably the best place to start is a good old-fashioned punch. Besides making sure to curl your fingers and keep your thumb outside, it's all about how you launch that fist. It can be with more of a boxing style, in which your hands operate independently from one another, or it can be more of a karate or taekwondo style, where it's a push-pull mechanism. In the case of Uncharted 1 Nathan Drake, his style clearly has some influence from boxing, as he's able to bob and weave with extraordinarily good timing and counterattack with vicious strikes like this deadly uppercut. But when you pay close attention to his punches, they aren't that well executed. For example, when he launches an attempted back fist and it whiffs, he immediately proceeds to launch a powerful hook, or as it's more colloquially known, a haymaker. But the important thing to observe is how his other arm behaves. It wildly swings off to the side instead of either going near his cheek, as boxing would have you do, or being tucked by his waist, as karate would. This is always a clear sign of someone who hasn't had martial arts training, as they will routinely swing their arms wildly when punching with not much style or control. But returning to how Drake clearly has been inspired and heavily influenced by certain martial arts, let's explore which ones those are. Drake has a strong upper body and is incredibly agile and nimble in order to climb pretty much anything, so it makes sense that he would rely on a style that makes good use of his arms and torso, and that would be boxing. Whether it's delivering jabs, crosses, a series of uppercuts to the torso or the jaw, Nate clearly strongly favors punching his enemies in a myriad of ways that echoes boxing's foundations, even though his technique is not stylistically perfect nor trained. However, Nate does mix up his fighting style by using other techniques that aren't a common punch. He frequently uses the aforementioned back fist, and although it clearly does not look like a trained one, it still gets the job done. He also sometimes uses his elbows when he's in close, whether it be delivering it after a spin, or sometimes directly to the jaw. Quick knees also make an appearance, but before grouping that with Muay Thai, it makes much more sense to group these techniques with his inkling towards being inspired by karate techniques. He's got the back fist, and he also routinely uses quick roundhouse kicks to the gut to double over his opponent. Therefore, the back fist, elbow strikes, knees, and roundhouse kicks all clearly feel inspired by karate in their form more than any other art. And oh yeah, he also executes the Bet you didn't see that one coming up. Sometimes he does have a flair for the overly dramatic and theatrical, and that's when he resorts to techniques such as incredibly popular dropkick. This technique is also known as a double sidekick, and is frequently seen in pro wrestling. It's a highly theatrical technique and not terribly practical. Just like in pro wrestling, Nate also favors throwing a headbutt. Drake can sometimes sneak up to an enemy and take him out silently, and for that he relies on a modified and lethal version of the rear naked choke. Instead of trying to cut off blood flow to the brain like a traditional rear naked choke, he can yank the head to the side. We will examine these grappling techniques further on in the video. And now we move on to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. Plenty of Drake's favorite techniques remain the same, whether we're talking about his boxing techniques that involve delivering great uppercuts and hooks, or just bobbing and weaving, to even delivering a really solid jab. His other karate and pro wrestling inspired techniques continue to be part of his fighting repertoire, including the back fist, the roundhouse kick, reverse elbow, knee strikes, headbutts, and chokeholds. A big part of Nathan Drake's fighting arsenal is how well he makes use of the environment. Whether it's pushing his enemies off some stairs or a cliff, dragging them over a ledge, slamming them into a wall, or even smacking them against a washing machine. This is not part of any single fighting style, but it is a significant part of being a good fighter in general, and can be known as situational awareness. If you'd like to learn more about that aspect of fighting, check out my fighting skills series, as I've already analyzed characters such as Batman and Daredevil. Drake's corner takedowns also got significant improvements. This particular takedown is one of his favorites, as we will see it time and time again. It's a 12-6 elbow delivered directly to the jaw to end the fight before it even begins. What he does right here is execute a flying hammer fist. You basically add in a hop to the technique to bring down that much more power. This one right here is a roundhouse kick that seamlessly transitions into a gesa gatame, or scarf hold. This hold is seen in pro wrestling and in martial arts like judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, also known as jiu-jitsu. Nate's fighting style also relies on counters. The key to a successful counter, both in-game and in real life, is timing. You immediately react once your opponent telegraphs their attack, giving you a chance to dodge and counterattack. As right after your enemy attacks, he's at his weakest. Whether it's a spinning reverse elbow or a knee to the face, the concept remains the same. You've probably seen this technique in pro wrestling and films. It's known as a Superman punch. There's also a variation of it, in which you push off from a fence or wall with your foot, and this is a variation Marcus used in my feature film Soul Hunters. Nate also incorporates jumping with this roundhouse kick right here. The technique isn't perfect, but it gets the job done. Besides the dropkick making a return in Uncharted 2, in this corner takedown we can see Nathan Drake performing another pro wrestling technique. It's a variation of the double axe handle. In this technique you interlock your fingers and bring them down over your opponent. In Nate's case, he swings upward. It's not terribly effective in real life, but it does look cool. This move is a sorta kinda belly to back suplex frequently seen in pro wrestling. In judo and jiu-jitsu, it's known as an uron nage, and it looks extremely similar to a suplex when you're countering someone who's trying to throw you. Nate does venture a little further from pro wrestling and into traditional wrestling or judo and jiu-jitsu with this grappling move right here. This is actually an excellent setup for a double leg takedown. Note how he is diving towards the lead leg. This is because you never want to dive towards the other leg, as your opponent can easily counterattack. However, right after this perfect setup, he goes right back to his theatrical tendency as he opts to throw this guy over his head with seemingly superhuman strength. Moving on to Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, in terms of new movements, there really aren't any. He fights in very much the same way we've seen before with his fighting backbone of boxing, karate, and pro wrestling. As you can see, there are several moves from his previous entries, whether it be tons of punches, elbows, knees, or roundhouses, it's all here and in spades. The main difference is that Nate has acquired an even more incredible situational awareness and can now handle himself perfectly with multiple attackers. He keenly dodges and weaves attacks and can also counter with a well-placed kick or punch when he needs to. He really displays just how much confidence he has in himself in this bar fight. He will drop kick someone to get out of a jam, throw reverse elbows, push kicks, punches, knees, whatever it takes. When he goes against bigger guys, he's great at landing solid counterattacks, like this quick push kick to the back. Against this brute, who is seemingly invulnerable to his attacks, he takes a cue from the Punisher and uses the environment to win the fight. Whether it's a toilet stall, a refrigerator, or even a giant wrench, anything can come in handy as a striking tool. Not that he has had any military training, but in the Marine Corps, this is known as using weapons of opportunity or an improvised weapon. Nate will also readily use guns as melee weapons, and will take the opportunity of landing a big punch to get his own weapon. Not exactly a formal disarm, but more of an opportunity-based one. This knife fight is a good example of the limitations of learning how to fight without any formal training. He knows good timing, and knows how to counterattack, but just doesn't know how to disarm a knife properly. So he tries everything, from biting the guy's wrist, to elbowing and throwing a back fist, to just plain kicking and kneeing him. Nothing works, and he ends up being saved by Sully. Before moving on to Uncharted 4, let's take a look at him in Uncharted Golden Abyss. You can immediately see several of the same techniques we've analyzed before, with the same concepts being utilized. There's some fun combos in his hand-to-hand combat. He still uses the very same countering skills we've seen before to avoid getting hit. There are two key quick-time event fights, and they are actually great close-ups of techniques we've seen. Here we could see Nate throw a quick feint jab to mask the real cross, a real boxing technique frequently used in amateur and pro boxing tournaments. We also get to see more boxing technique mixed in with solid knee strikes and the aforementioned double axe handle. His weakness against knife fights also comes into play. He knows how to avoid getting stabbed, but not exactly how to control and disarm it, and relies on the environment to win, which in this case is the stairs. We do get to see him execute a great technique right here. In judo and jiu-jitsu, it's known as a tomo e nage. In the technique, you place your foot on the opponent and use their weight and momentum to roll them over you. In this case, it works like a charm, since his opponent is throwing his full weight onto him with a running head start, so of course he flies off way behind Nathan. With all his previous entries broken down, it's now time to move on to his last entry in the franchise to date, Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Much like in Uncharted 3, Drake retains and displays several of the same combat moves we've already broken down, and does use them in inventive ways. Same kicks, punches, and elbows we've been seeing since his early days in the franchise. By the same token, he is now exceedingly adept at handling himself in a melee fight, as most easily demonstrated during his present fights. Although in terms of grappling, Drake was limited to a couple pro wrestling moves and chokeholds, he now returns with some pretty advanced techniques, such as this excellent armbar that applies the same principle as Sam Fisher's, where you use opposing forces to manipulate your opponent. You use your opponent's forearm and shoulder to create a lever in order to slam your opponent on the wall. This technique looks like a great variation of the kote gaeshi, a common and effective wrist lock. It's seen in Aikido, but also makes an appearance in Jiu-Jitsu. Nate modifies it by not applying the technique to the wrist, but to the gun instead, in order to flip the enemy over. This throw right here is the one seen in Captain America Winter Soldier, and it's known as the Bonseo Nage. We've just seen a couple grappling techniques that make an appearance in Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, and Aikido, but in the case of Nathan Drake, I'm going to be pairing these techniques with Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu is frequently taught in a military setting, as seen in Sam Fisher's episode when we explored US Navy SEAL training. I've also seen it applied firsthand during my time training Jiu-Jitsu under the Valente Brothers umbrella. Considering that Nate spends a grand majority of his time in a military-like setting where he has to fight people hand-to-hand with guns, it makes sense to group these techniques with Jiu-Jitsu over any other grappling art. Moving on, here we get to see Drake finally execute a good old tackle. It's not a double leg takedown since his hand placement is off, but it looks pretty similar to what is known as a spear in pro wrestling. His fight with Nadine once again shows what a lack of training can do to you. Despite his best efforts, he is hardly able to inflict any damage. During his second fight with her, he even has his brother aiding him, and he still takes a pretty severe beating. He even remarks, "How does she do that?" And the answer is through years of training. This concept is most clearly seen during his final sword fight with Rafe. He's obviously great at dodging, just like he was great at dodging the knife in both Abyss and Deception. However, if you notice, his sword technique is not that refined or even decent at all. He wildly overswings the sword and leaves himself open to being counterattacked. As a matter of fact, he does the most damage when he goes back to his basics. A punch, a kick, a knee strike. Anything that doesn't really involve the sword. Nate ends up on the floor, but he does win the fight, not by outskilling Rafe, but by outsmarting him. He therefore will not receive fencing as a fighting style, since even Rafe confirms that he really can't fence at all. Like many fighters before him on fighting styles, Nathan also relies on his expertise with weapons during his many encounters. He's an extremely accurate shooter, and has experience with a variety of weapons including pistols, grenade launchers, assault rifles, and many more. Although he's never formally trained, his style seems to lend itself really well to combat shooting. Combat shooting has a big emphasis in refining one's technique for situations that would arise in military combat. As to why I'm including his weapons training as a fighting style, it's because he easily weaves it into his overall performance on the battlefield, typically switching between unarmed tactics and firing his web description and become a member. Returning to the topic at hand, how many fighting styles does Nathan Drake know in the Uncharted series? They are boxing, karate, pro wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and combat shooting, for a grand total of 5 fighting styles. This episode of Fighting Styles was sponsored by Skillshare. I'd like to thank each one of my Patreon members as their contribution helped in the making of this video. If you'd like to contribute and appear in the credits in the future, my Patreon page is Godzillarex, and it's in the description below. What do you think of the Uncharted games? What other characters should I analyze next? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe for more awesome videos, and see you next time.